I am actually delighted that I present Mario today. Mario, a distinguished public choice scholar. The focus of his research output is the economics of revolution, religion, and extremism. So there is Mario Ferrero. Uh, he, amongst other things, amongst other achievements, one probably should mention Mario as a winner of the Otto Eckstein Prize twice, actually, offered by the Eastern Economic Journal. And amongst his other visits up and down the world, I think these two actually stand in Canada. Uh, at this moment, Mario is actually just finished a book, and I had the privilege to preview it. The book is published by Springer, so it's coming up. It's called The Political Economy of Indo-European Polytheism. On a personal level, there is only one thing that I can say about Mario. He is a devoted friend, and he's always prepared to sacrifice his time to help others, myself included. Only one complaint. He's telling me off that I like cappuccino in the afternoon. He says I should not be drinking milk in the afternoon. Mario, over to you.
Okay, let me share the slides, right?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you, George, for the very nice words of introduction. Much too nice. As George mentioned, I'm not presenting a paper today, but an outline of this book that you can see now, as he already anticipated, which is about to come out. In the next few days, I'll be correcting the proofs, so I expect it to be out by the end of the spring. Okay. This book is a product of years of research. It builds on 3 articles, all published on Homo economicus journal. So I'm playing at home today here, so to speak, right? And the 3 articles are those that you can read there. One, the first, really, with George. The second, with 2 colleagues. One is an expatriate Indian economist, and the other is a scholar of Indian religion, an American scholar of Indian religion, and the third only by myself, just by myself. The basic framework was established in those articles, but in this book there is a lot more, especially a lot more historical material is now surveyed that was not part of the articles. Okay. So can you see the slides? Yes. Okay. So this is the table of content of the book, only the chapters, not the sections. There is an introduction, of course. Then there are 3 chapters in the part called the beginnings, which survey the religions that I'm dealing with. The Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, the Germans, the Indians, and the Iranians. Okay, I should say the Celts include both the continental Celts, that is the Gauls, as seen by the Roman writers, the ancient Roman writers, and the Irish that are observed much later in Ireland. And the Germans also include both the continental Germans observed by Roman historians, especially Tacitus, at an early time, and then the Scandinavians, the Vikings especially, whose work came down to writing much later in the 13th century, basically, right? Then there is a second part which deals with the fate that those religions underwent. Extinction was what befell the Celts, the Germans, the Greeks, and the Romans. Death and rebirth, that is a kind of reform, was the fate of the Indians and the Iranians. And then in the third part, the economics is directly brought in. There are two chapters of economic analysis and models. And these two chapters are designed in such a way that the reader who is not trained, has no economic training or no interest simply, can quite safely skip chapter 8 because all the formal models are in chapter 8, whereas the verbal argument is carried out in chapter 7. Okay. Now, we know that polytheism is the earliest religion of mankind, that is religion proper, right? Before that, we had what is called animism or shamanism or things like that. In a polytheistic religion, there are gods who have a personality and functions, and very often stories to tell or to be told about. Those religions, as I just mentioned, had a very different outcomes in later times. Some became extinct. Vedic religion underwent a mutation into what we call now Hinduism, and the Iranian religion was reformed into Zoroastrianism, which is the first monotheistic religion in the world. Okay. So the basic question that drives my research is why this divergence? Why is it that they had such different faiths since they all stem from a common root, which we are going to see now? And strange as it may seem, this question has never been asked, possibly because it was thought to be too big and forbidding. But here, I think economics can help and make things somewhat more manageable. Why only the Indo-Europeans? Believe me, it was already a lot of work to account for them. But why just Indo-Europeans and not the others? Simply because they all derive from one original people called the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Those people had a common language, a common material culture, and a common religion, which to some extent can be reconstructed from linguistics and from mythology, as we will see. Okay. If so, if they started as one people with one religion, then the divergence of later times, of historical times, must be due to different conditions and different indigenous peoples that they encountered during their migration from the original homeland to the final destinations that are observed historically. So this is basically excluding all the religions that are not part of the Indo-European family is a way of constructing a natural experiment in religious evolution, right? That like observing disturbances brought to the original framework. All right. Why economics? Because multiple gods and multiple cults for those gods raise the issue of choice. That is, are people free to choose the deity that they want to worship, or are they constrained to worship them all? If the latter is true, costs to supplicants become salient, become important, and the supplicants would stand to gain or benefit from religious reform or innovation that could save them some of those costs or those efforts towards satisfaction their religious needs. Okay. By the way, from now on, when I say supplicant, I mean not necessarily an individual. It could be a group. It could be a whole city. It could be a corporate group, a profession, an association, the state itself, anything that may be the subject of worship or of religious cult. Okay. Then why political economy? Because a basic point is that big changes in religious systems are never the work of individuals or common people, but require religious professionals or priests. Okay, And the priest must have both the means and the incentives to undertake the reform when a reform is appropriate. Okay, so the organization of the priesthood is a key to the whole story, right? So we will model, or rather the book will model both the theology and the priesthood and the interaction between the two. Okay, and let me submit that modeling theology is perhaps the main theoretical innovation of the book. Right. The economics that is used in the book is very basic and very parsimonious in a way. It's the basic concepts of exchange and competition. In all those religions, really, in all polytheistic religions of the world, the cult, that is, the relationship between man and God was or is transactional. That is, the supplicant demands or expects benefits, blessings from the gods, and believes that the gods could and would provide those benefits if enticed by adequate offerings in the appropriate way. So it's a gift exchange relationship, basically. Okay? The supplicants believed that several gods were involved in each transaction, not just one, but several. That is, several gods or goddesses were able to influence the same events of importance to them, right? So if we have multiple agents involved on each side of a transaction, this suggests to an economist a market, right? A religious market. And then the question is this market competitive or not? And if it is competitive, is this competition good or not? Of course, the economist's instinct is to say that a competition is always good and monopoly bad. As we will see, in our case, things are a bit different. We'll come to that. Of course, the gods in the transaction were represented by human agents, either priests or devotional associations. The gods are just a place name for those things, for those people, those groups. And so, economically speaking, we view both gods and priests as selfish people, maximizing their utility, and subject to a budget constraint. In particular, the constraint that limits the gods' achieved utility level is the resources available to the supplicant, right? And these resources may be money, may be material goods, maybe just time, their time, or the effort that they are willing to expend in cultic actions. Let's come to the origin of all this. PIE for Proto-Indo-European religion, right? As I mentioned, a PIE society, according to those who study these things, existed for perhaps a couple of millennia between the 5th and the 3rd millennium BCE. And its place, its homeland, was the steppe and the forest of southern Russia and Ukraine. By the way, more or less exactly where the war is raging these days. Interesting enough. The Proto-Indo-European gods that, as I mentioned before, first of all can be detected by linguistic reconstruction, starting from the daughter languages and going up to the hypothetical Proto-Indo-European language, okay? But the gods that are found by this linguistic procedure are few and not particularly telling and not specifically Indo-European. For example, the Latin god Jupiter that many of you may be familiar with, that is certainly one, but there are not many. And not very interesting findings about that. And so, naturally enough, the next step, the next resort is to turn from linguistics to mythology, right? And here we must deal for a moment with the lifelong work of Georges de Mézil, who was a French scholar of the 20th century, who devoted a lifetime to these things, to the study of Indo-European mythology and its the reconstruction of that religion. He put forward the so-called three functional hypothesis. That is, the PIE society had three social classes: priests, warriors, commoners, in charge of the three functions that are basic to any such society, that is, religion and law, that are joined in a way, war and production, economic production. Also, production includes also reproduction, that is, fertility of crops, of animals, and of women. This is important. And so, according to Dumézil, there were typically three major gods presiding over each of these functions. Okay? The theory has been controversial all the time, from the beginning. Some people argued that the real major gods, the functions, and so the major gods were not three, but more than three. Then Dumézil himself recognized that the sovereign function, the first function, is not really one, but is represented by two gods, a couple or a pair, more accurately, like Mitra and Varuna in the Rig Veda, in the Indian scriptures, in the Vedic scriptures, or other examples. Then the warrior gods not necessarily is one, but that there may be several, and especially the third function, the production and reproduction function, has many faces, embodying many, sometimes really a tribe of gods and goddesses. And then another objection is that once the migrations were over and the Indo-European peoples were settled in their final destinations, that is Italy, Gaul, the British Islands, Germany, Scandinavia, India, Iran, and so on, Greece, the three classes were no more. It was a much different, more complicated social structure, except in India, where by some kind of reverse evolution, the three classes hardened into the three varna, four varna really, but because there's a lower one, the lowest one of the classic definition of the caste society or class society. Anyway, for me or for us, the problem is not the tripartition itself, but whether it can account for a given pantheon. That is, what I want to know is whether by this approach we can identify a structure of a pantheon, of a divine structure that is neatly divided, in which the gods are neatly divided and allocated each to a different function. Okay, this is the thing that I care about. There is an archaic example of this that fits pretty well Dumézil's theory. He himself brings it. Read this sentence from Herodotus describing the pantheon of the Thracians, sometimes in the 5th century BCE. They had these three gods or goddesses, but the princes, unlike the commoners, worship Hermes as well. Herodotus here is using the Greek corresponding names for those gods, in his view, at least. Okay, so we have two sovereign gods, according to Dumézil here. Dionysus taking care of the magical side of sovereignty, Hermes taking care of the legal side of sovereignty, the law. Then we have a warrior god, Ares, and then a goddess of the wild, Artemis, taking care of the third function. So the point here is that here they are very few and clearly specialized by function and tailored, of course, to a simple society of raiders who were preying on neighboring settled societies. The point is that exactly this, is that after migration and settlement, the divine company expands, the functions become blurred and overlap, and the jurisdictions of the different gods overlap with one another. Okay, and so the pristine simplicity of the thresholds is no longer to be seen almost anywhere. So my questions are three throughout the book. One is the number of gods or goddesses, old, new. Do they increase in numbers over historical time that we can observe? Are there foreign influences or substrates from the autochthonous populations? Second, the specialization of the gods, or otherwise, the alternative is multifunctional or generalist gods with broad powers. Okay, if the second option is true, we have a problem of overlap. Jurisdictions overlap if they are not clearly specialized. Okay, and then finally, but most importantly, the jealousy of the gods. Do they all demand allegiance from worshippers? And would they punish a worshipper who deserted them? This is critical, as we will see. If all the important gods could be sorted out into clear-cut functions with no overlap, or if worshipper could pick and choose a god or goddess of their liking to do everything they need a god to do for them, without jealousy, in other words, then everything will be easy, but our religions are not like that. So we are guided by these three questions throughout. Now, I will skip 5 chapters entirely. All the historical chapters, it would take me a couple of hours at least to just minimally describe them. So I must rely on whatever you know about it by yourself, and on the very concise summaries I will make now. There's no other choice. I have to make a choice. Here is a table in 2 parts, a table that has all the religions are observed on the rows, as you can see, and on the columns, 14 features of interest. The first 5 regard the gods, okay? The 6th regards the afterlife, if there is any such thing, okay? The 7th is the eschatology, the end of the world, if there is such a thing. Then 8 is whether there is asceticism or renunciation, and whether it's relevant. Then the purity code. Then who entered the picture in the course of history, whether anybody did. Then 11, 12, 13 are critical regarding the priests. And then finally the spread of the religion outside its original homeland. Now, reading this is too impossibly arid for you to follow, so I better turn to a typology based on the table. Okay, we have 3 types. The first is the Greeks, the Romans, and the Greco-Romans. Greco-Romans means the somewhat unified religion that prevailed in the Roman Empire after the Roman Empire conquered Greece and all the Greek colonies, and then there was a kind of merger or convergence of the original Greek and Roman religions, which were quite different at the beginning, into some unified whole that prevailed to the very end of paganism, when the Roman Empire was Christianized. Okay, so these groups had very, very many gods and goddesses from the beginning, from the earliest times, including the Mycenaean society prior to classical Greece. These gods were increasing in number all the time, both from some kind of endogenous formation and especially from the importation of foreign gods from other peoples. Okay, They were very balanced from the beginning between gods and goddesses. For example, in the classic Olympians, the 12 Olympian gods, which were the peak of the Greek pantheon, in one rendering, they were 6 gods and 6 goddesses. And the same was true for the Romans, basically. Okay. The overlap of jurisdiction was very substantial and increasing over time. The gods were jealous and were perceived to be jealous, so it was very dangerous for a worshipper to neglect a god. Since the beginning, there are stories and in the epics and the mythology and so on, stories about that, frightening stories. And the gods were immoral. They were not to be loved, but just feared. Okay. There was no notion whatsoever that the behavior of people in this life would meet a reward or punishment in the next life. The next life, the kingdom of the dead, was a bleak thing, equal for all. Okay. The entry of foreign gods was, initially at least, regulated by the state, or in the late empire, there were these so-called Oriental cults that spread privately without any regulation, but they were not competitive with the official civic religion in any case. And finally, this is very important, this is the key really, the priests were not professional but part-time officials. They were specialized, not general priests for every purpose or every god, but they were specialized. In Greece, they were specialized to, a priest was a priest of a particular temple, of a particular god in a particular place. In Rome, it was more a specialization by function because the temples themselves didn't have a priest in charge of them, not really. But in any way, in all cases, the appointment was made from people who had other business in life. There were not really professional priests, with very few exceptions, okay? The appointment was either temporary or for life in Rome, but in any case, they were part-time officials, okay? There were no scriptures, no holy books, no priestly schools, nothing like that. Second type, the Germans and the Celts. The question mark here is because, let me say this as a disclaimer, because the treatment of the Celts is the most unsatisfactory part of the book. That is not because I didn't devote time to that. I did devoted even too much, in my view, in retrospect. Not because of that, but because the sources that I could find are extremely confused and confusing. So I couldn't come up with a clear picture of it. So many things are conjectures, unfortunately. So these groups had a fair number of gods from the beginning, but nothing comparable to the Greeks or the Romans. And the overlap between the jurisdictions was substantial, at least so it seems. The Germanic goddesses were important, but unlike with the Greeks and the Romans, they were specialized basically to the third function, as Dumézil would say. The Celts, on the other hand, had something of a great goddess with very broad powers. The number of Scandinavian gods didn't expand over time, unlike the Greeks and the Romans, but if anything, it shrank. And they began to allow in the late period, in the late Viking period, they began to allow something like a personal choice of gods, okay? Any person could choose a protector god or goddess of their choice, which implies that the gods were not thought to be jealous of one another. And some of them were moral, ethical, others were not. There was a glorious afterlife for the elite, the nobility, the warriors, etc., not for the commoners. And they had uniquely developed eschatology predicting an end of the world and the overturning of everything and so on. There was no entry of foreign gods, as far as we know. Uh, on the priesthood, they were different because the Celts had a very strong professional generalist priesthood called the Druids, with priestly schools and everything, but no scripture. The German priesthood was, on the other hand, only embryonic in the sense that most priestly functions were really carried out by chiefs or kings, not by professional priests. There were some professional priests at the very end of the pagan period, but not much. Finally, type 3, Vedic Indians and early Iranians, they had a sizable pantheon. The goddesses were absolutely minor, had an absolutely minor place in it. There was some overlap, at least embryonically, a jealousy. There are some stories contained in Rig Vedic hymns about this. Some of these gods were ethical, others were not. They too had an aristocratic notion of a paradise for the elite, but then in late Vedic time, the general idea of renunciations came up, the pursuit of salvation through renunciations. This was very clear in the books called the Upanishads, whereas there was nothing of the kind in Iran, as far as you can tell. The Vedic Indians did face alien local cults in the subcontinent when they spread over the Indian subcontinent, and then they met a very stiff challenge from the ascetic sects, the Buddhists, the Jains, and others, starting in perhaps the 5th century BCE. Whereas there was no entry of anybody or no challenge in Iran. The priests of both groups were, as we know well, professional priests, generalist priests, very systematically trained, with a sacred literature that kept growing in size over time, and who were separated by the rest of the population by very stringent purity rules, purity codes. Now, turning to the substance, why should numbers and jurisdictions of gods change? Okay, beginning with numbers. The migration in the settlement into new lands with a different environment, different resources, a different economic structure, and etc., different indigenous peoples brought new concerns and needs. And so the so-called portable religion of the Proto-Indo-Europeans was subject to a pressure for change. Portable religion because it was really a portable thing with no fixed place of worship, no scriptures to carry because the whole learning was oral, nothing, just they could demarcate a piece of ground in a place and set up a sacrifice there. This changed, of course, with settlement. Okay, so new gods were introduced and or old gods broadened the jurisdictions they used to have. For example, just quickly, Athena was a goddess existing from Mycenaean times, but then when in an insignificant village called Athens in mainland Greece grew into a big important city, Athens, right? She was made the patron goddess of the city with an epithet, Athena Polias, by the way. Proto-Indo-European god of the fresh water, which the Romans called Neptune, and the Indians and the Iranians Apam Napat, was brought to the Mediterranean by the Greeks, where they found a sea, right? And so he became a god of the sea, not the fresh water, called Poseidon by the Greeks, and the equivalent to Neptune for the Romans. Same thing for Dionysus. When they discovered wine, they invented a god of wine. And when contract and the keeping of oaths became important with the migrations, they set up a god of that, the god of oaths and contracts, which is Mitra or Mithra, according to whether we are in the Vedic setting or the Iranian one. But then the problem is, why divinize abstractions and concerns? Okay, this is important because a concern claims no cult, whereas a god or goddess does. And this is costly. We have an argument from cognitive psychology, someone called Boyer, Pascal Boyer, interesting book. And he says that there are agency detection systems in our mind that are biased toward over-detection. In other words, if something happens that could be due to many causes, the system in our mind tends to ascribe it to the agency of some animated entity, like a god. Exactly, could be that, rather than not. Why this bias towards over-detection of animacy or agency behind events? This is grounded in our past evolution, our ancient past as hunters and gatherers. Okay, in a predator-prey context, the cost of false positives is minimal. That is, if you see an agent where there are none, it's not a big deal if you can quickly discard the false positive once discovered. Whereas the cost of a false negative, that is not detecting a predator or a prey when they are actually around, could be very high for you. That's the origin of the bias. An economist can rephrase this in the following way. Risk-averse people, as we all are, rationally prefer to buy protection from a god that may not exist or not be active in the given situation, rather than risk the anger of a god that may exist by ignoring them. Okay, so inventing or imagining a god there is a functional substitute for buying insurance against uncertainties. But in ancient societies that were not typically enlightened by science and by empirical testing of hypotheses, false positives were never discovered, really. So the new gods became permanent. They were entrenched. They were there to stay. And so was the cost of their cult. Similarly, gods no longer useful, antiquated, were never dropped, but left in a corner. You may need them in the future, just in case. Leave it there. So the working rule to run a pantheon was always add, never delete. And similarly, the same idea for jurisdictions of existing gods. If you are in doubt whether this particular god is also active in field B besides field A, then put him there, okay? So in case of doubt, always add to the jurisdiction, never subtract from it. For example, a Greek bride should make offerings to at least 3 goddesses when marrying, plus local ones, lest no one be offended and angered. A general going to war should sacrifice to at least Ares and Athena to be safe, to keep on the safe side, and so on and so forth. So, some real fossils survived in Rome to the very end of the empire, of the pagan empire. And in the same way, we know that the great Vedic gods did not die out, but survived in the Hindu pantheon as minor figures with a specialized role, and so on. So this is rephrasing. But why should, what am I doing? Sorry. Yeah. Why should the jurisdictional overlap be a problem? Think of a market analogy. It seems like the change from in an industry from a collection of specialty shops to department stores. Instead of having a butcher, a baker, and something else, you have a general store selling everything, right? So the overlap proliferates, but so what? In the limit, you might have a single store, a shopping mall where there's everything you may need, or if products are differentiated by quality, you have a few great stores, which is what we call monopolistic competition. But what this analogy misses is the seller's jealousy and the seller's capacity to act upon their jealousy. In legal markets, commercial markets, sellers can punish customers who desert them. Only criminals can do that, right? Moreover, patronizing one store for all purchases is no protection for the customers from the anger of the other stores unless the owner or the gang offers a protection record, okay? So the jurisdictional overlap is a problem only because of divine jealousy. The fear of God's wrath at their neglect, even if unintentional, was ubiquitous in antiquity, and religious institutions and rituals worked to keep it under control by incurring substantial costs. Further, the gods would not infringe on one another's claim to worship. No protection was offered to the supplicant against angry fellow gods. Read Artemis from Euripides saying, "The rule among us gods is this: none of us will go against the will of another. Instead, we will stand aside." Okay? So this world was stuck in what I call the supplicant's dilemma. Under scarcity, when the supplicant has not enough resource to fully satisfy two gods claiming jurisdiction over the same field, any change in the allocation of offerings that makes one god better off will make the other worse off, implying anger and retaliation because they are jealous. Okay? But then why perceive the gods are jealous? But for the same reason as above, it's safer to think of the god as revengeful and therefore dangerous, and hence by protection by appropriate rituals, rather than risking the opposite. In other words, the over-detection bias implies an overestimation of the risk entailed by neglect. And again, the false positives there were not easily discovered, which is what they call a confirmation bias. So the bottom line is that the industrial organization of polytheism was inefficient, even though the allocation of offerings across gods might be efficient. There were too many gods, too costly to feed, and too dangerous to leave. Okay? Now, how do you get out from the supplicant's dilemma? There are four ways, theoretically. One is simply the concentration of supply, which is at least a partial solution. Instead of having gods A and B both dealing with benefits X and Y, have one god A displace or take over god B or merge with god B and become the sole provider of both X and Y, period. So this would shrink the pantheon, so reduce overlap, and with it reduce jealousy. Okay, supplicants would be willing to patronize this change, which would translate these welfare gains into entrepreneurs' profits. This never happened in the Greek and Roman world because the Greco-Roman priests had no class organization and were not an interest group, as I said before. So the rise of Christianity was basically unopposed. Second, enabling a god to protect his followers from his peers' retaliation. This was the way undertaken embryonically, at least, by the late Vikings, when they were choosing, in quotes, a protector god, mostly Thor or Freya, the two together, making them a near universal god or goddess. This doesn't remove jealousy, but makes it toothless by providing universal insurance against it. Right? 3. Parallel monotheisms. This is my wording. I haven't found it anywhere. In Hinduism, which is the new pantheon that supplanted the Vedic one, each of the eponymous deities of the new sects, the three great sects were those devoted to Shiva, Vishnu, and the Devi, that is the goddess. Each of them was the supreme lord or lady of the universe with a universal jurisdiction. Okay. In each sect, the other deities were there with sort of secondary functions, or they were partial manifestations of the Supreme Lord, so the overlap was neutralized. On the other hand, the major gods of the other sects were honored as junior partners of the sect's presiding god, which eliminated the jealousy between sects. In other words, in a Shaiva sect, Vishnu was honored as someone who was worthy of worship with a special limited place, a junior function, a junior partner. But beyond this, the theology from the Upanishad to onward said that all the gods are basically only manifestations of the Brahman, that is the ultimate reality of the universe, and they are just equivalent paths to reach it. So each major god or major sect offers a way to salvation that is a release from the cycle of rebirth, what is called the moksha by the Hindus, and nirvana by the Buddhists, basically the same thing. So since the supplicant here chooses a major god who protects him from the other's jealousy, the Hindu way is not so different from the Vikings' choice of God, but it required a new pantheon. And second, most importantly, the theological turnaround was managed by the Brahmins, unlike with the Vikings. Okay, so the traditional Vedic priesthood transitioned to the new theology basically without harm. Fourth way is creating a divine hierarchy in the pantheon, and that was the Zoroastrian reform, which created a single hierarchy peaking at a supreme god Ahura Mazda, with every other deity as a helper with a specialized function behind him, below him. Sorry. Some old gods thought to be bad or amoral were cast off the pantheon as demons, Indras especially, and a few others. And all the believers were involved in a struggle between good and evil in everyday life till the end of days. This is the dualism of Zoroastrianism. So this is the first single monotheism, although it was rescuing the good gods of paganism in the new framework, into the new framework, which of course eased the transition to the new religion. And this was, of course, the work of a priestly class, which stood to gain from it. And before that, a great prophet, you may not know that Zoroaster himself was a trained priest of the old religion, which is rare in history, by the way. So a mind-blowing thought that occurred to me, but it's not it's just mentioned in the book, is that if at the end of all these paths lies the same thing, the ultimate reality is the same, can we say that the Indian route is Pareto superior to the Iranian one because it allows more than one path to choose from instead of just one? Although the implications of this in this world are complex, so I would leave it there for some further thinking. How do we explain the divergent outcomes now? An enduring theological reform, as we have seen, was necessary to get out of the supplicant's dilemma. But this cannot be the work of atomistic consumer choice or shifting of consumer beliefs, but it can only come from entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneurs can only be the existing priests. Okay. The only people who would potentially be able to take advantage of the profit or power opportunities offered by reform in a setting in which the polytheistic equilibrium was inefficient. Okay. In India, the incentives to the priests to do that were generated by the withering of royal support, and as well as the competition from the ascetic sects, The alternative being the probable collapse of Brahmanism as a class. In Iran, there was a prophet who had the foresight to take advanced action and eliminate divine jealousy at root. In both cases, a pre-existing monopolistic organization of the priests was essential. They were able to maintain their cohesion and manage the transition and benefit from it. Okay. The priests were not subordinate to the rulers, but independent providers of religious services and other services to the royalty, which is something we don't have time to dwell on here. The opposite occurred in the Greco-Roman world, which was plagued by supplicants' dilemmas and weighed down by the costs to contain the dilemma and manage the risk. Sorry. There were opportunities for radical reform, even more perhaps than in India or in Iran, but no one was able and willing to exploit them because the priests, as I mentioned before, were atomized by locality, god, temple, or function, devoted only a minor part of their time to religion, never recognized themselves or acted as a class, as a social group, and were completely subordinate to the power of the state which appointed them. So they were neither equipped for taking the leadership of religious reform nor interested in doing that. So for an economist, they had a fundamental collective action problem in which each priest found it advantageous to free ride on the others, and they never found a way to solve the problem. The Celts had a strong priestly class, but did not resist Christianizations. I have to skip something here because it's too late. So there are further features of the theology that confirm the picture, but I want this. We have the outcome of all this discussion is there are two institutional equilibria. Okay. One is the Greco-Roman equilibrium, in which jealous gods are matched with atomized and non-cooperative priests. The promotion in this system, the promotion of traditional civic religion was a collective good for the priests, of course, that absent a professional corporate organization was not provided collectively, but privately. We economists know that the private provision of public goods is less than optimal, right? Nevertheless, the system endured for millennia, really for 1200 years or so, because it was never really challenged until the rise of Christianity. The other is the Hindu and Zoroastrian equilibrium, in which non-jealous gods matched with corporate cooperative priests, whereas the Celtic and Viking arrangements were not equilibria. There was a mismatch between theology and priesthood. With the Celts, they had a non-reformed theology with a powerful priesthood. The Vikings had a spontaneous theological reform from below, so to speak, unsupported by professional priests. The Greco-Roman equilibrium was a spontaneous order, as they say. All these people who are fond to talk about the beauty of spontaneous orders, like Hayek's idea of the competitive market and so on, should pause to see that a spontaneous order can be terribly bad. The Greco-Roman equilibrium was a terribly bad, inefficient, spontaneous order. By contrast, the Hindu and Zoroastrian equilibrium is an order built and controlled by design, and so it lasts until the agent finds it in their interest to maintain it. It may, though need not, but it may produce welfare improvements. In this case, it made it possible to escape from the jealous god's trap. A test of the welfare improving character of this is the ability to spread to new lands and people. The Zoroastrian spread to all Iranian peoples. The Brahmins extended their religious monopoly outside their homeland to the whole Indian subcontinent, the Himalayas, and many countries in Southeast Asia. And that required, of course, a reform. It wouldn't have probably been possible with the pre-reformed theology and organization. By the way, I have a model of this, of the missionary expansion in the book, but not for today. Where is this? No, sorry. Yeah. A message to the economists. Okay, no, I want tell you something about the models. Just can I have another 5 minutes? Hello?
No
Hello?
problem, of course.
Another 5 minutes?
Take your time.
Okay. Look at this. This is an Edgeworth box. Okay. A and B at the two corners here are two gods who both have jurisdictions on two matters or fields called X and Y. All right. And both gods, both A and B, care about both gods. In the region, where there is scarcity, SA is the satiation bundle for God A. That is, it is the bundle of offerings in both fields that make him fully satisfied. Same thing is SB for God B. Given the resources, that is the size of the box, it is not possible for the supplicant to fully satisfy both gods, that is, to achieve SA and SB at the same time. Okay? These gods have strictly convex preferences. Look at these indifference curves, 1 and 2 for God B, and this for God A. For amounts of goods above the satiation level, like for example here, the gods become neutrals. That is, they neither benefit nor harm the god, the beneficiary. Okay. So the thickened curve here connecting point SB with point SA is the contract curve, that is the set of Pareto optimal allocations of offerings between the two gods. This is the best that a supplicant can achieve in this situation. He can do no better than locate himself on any point on this curve. But once you are on the curve, the Pareto curve, any step that you make, for example, in the direction of SA, makes God A better, more satisfied, but God B less satisfied. This is the supplicant's dilemma. This would not occur if God were fully specialized, as in the old Dumézil's dream or in the very ancient examples that I mentioned. These are the same gods with the same satiation levels as B and SA, but God A cares only about benefit or field Y, which is measured on the vertical axis. God B cares only about God X, which is measured on the horizontal axis. So B's satiation point SB is here on the edge of the box, whereas A's satiation point is here on the vertical side of the box. Here, there's no dilemma. Both gods, if satiation points were outside the box, like these ones, SA prime, SB prime, then of course you don't get there, but you can't. But you go to point K, which is the most you can do. So you give all of God, all of good Y to God A, and all of good X to God B. If the points are SB and SA inside the box, so within reach with these resources, you can fully satisfy both gods, but of course you have too many resources devoted to religion. You can shrink the box and save resources for other purposes, as you can see. But then look at this. This is the sectarian Hinduism, the non-jealous gods. The same A and B with the same fields or benefits X and Y. Okay, they both care for it. Oh, sorry. The same association point as A for God A, as B for God B. Here, all the red lines refer to God A, all the blue lines refer to God B for clarity. All right. Now here, the difference with the previous thing is that preferences of both gods here are not convex, strictly convex, but they are concave, strictly concave to the origin. Okay, implying that it's preferable to go to an extreme, to a corner solution rather than being in the middle. Okay, I'm using for simplicity the extreme case of indifference curves that are L-shaped with a corner here. So this is the indifference curve of God A running through his satiation point. This here is another lower one. Same thing for God B. This is the indifference curve running through his satiation point as B, and this is a lower one. Now here, explaining is complex, but you can fully satisfy both gods without going to their respective satiation bundles. Okay, so point P here at this crossing is a Pareto optimal allocation that gives to both gods a bundle of offers equivalent in terms of utility to their satiation bundle, because P lies on the same indifference curve of God A's as his satiation bundle as A, and P also lies on the same indifference curve of God B, lying on his indifference bundle, satiation bundle as B. So this is completely eliminates the supplicant's dilemma. Okay, with the same resources as in the other world, you can fully satisfy both gods. But not only that, but you are unnecessarily tying resources to religion here. The box, I can't explain this, but the box can be squeezed, thereby saving resources for other purposes, other uses, non-religious uses, by simply squeezing the box to what was before the southeast quadrant. This one now becomes the whole box. Now both the new satiation bundles SA prime and SB prime lie outside the box, so they are not within reach. But the intersection of the indifference curves running through the satiation bundles, they do intersect at point P on the edge of the box. So this is feasible. So we save religious resources. Okay. A second on this. No, sorry. No. A second on this, just an illustration. I can't explain. I formulated the institutional equilibria that I mentioned before as a game between gods and priests. In particular, it's an assurance game with two Nash equilibria, a payoff dominant equilibrium and a risk dominant equilibrium. I can't explain it, but it's interesting. So the priests can have two strategies in quotes. One is to be corporate, the other is to be atomized, and the gods or the theology has two possible ways. One is to be non-jealous, the other is to be jealous. So we have, as the thing is constructed here, there are reasons for choosing these numbers, motivated by all the description that of the different religions in the book. In any way, HZ, this is the Hindu and Zoroastrian equilibrium, institutional equilibrium, with corporate priests and non-jealous gods. This one here, GR, is the Greek and Roman equilibrium with atomized priests and jealous gods. Okay, both are equilibria, but this spontaneous order and this requires design and purposeful action. This is the combination corporate priests and jealous gods is the Celts story, which is not an equilibrium in terms of this game. And the atomized priests and non-jealous gods here is the Viking story, which is not an equilibrium. I think I could, well, I would have liked to say something, to say something else, but I think it's enough. Sorry, let me just find, no, there was one thing. No. I could make a comment on polytheism versus monotheism from all this, and another on competition versus monopoly, but I'll better leave it there for now. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Manfred, I have some questions. May I ask?
Yes,
I believe you do.
Okay, I have three questions.
Yeah.
The first one is you see about Egypt. Did you do some such kind of analysis for Egyptian pantheon? And,
No.
No?
No, because they are not Indo-Europeans.
Oh, I see. I see. Then you said that monotheism was the first Zoroastrianism, but as far as I remember history, Shlomo's temple was built in 10th century BC, and Zoroastrianism grew up at 6th century. No?
No, sorry, I can fix this rapidly. This was an old chronology, according to what I read. Scholars of Iranian religion used to think that Zoroaster lived in the 6th century BC. But the new understanding of recent scholarship, which I'm following, is that he was much earlier. He lived somewhere around the middle of the second millennium BC, around between something like between 1200 and 1500 BC. So he was not only earlier than the Solomon's temple, but especially earlier than the transformation of Israel's religion into monotheism, which was a relatively speaking, a recent affair, although this is too long a story. So I think, and besides that, it seems that the early Jews at the time of the Babylonian exile absorbed many things from the Zoroastrians there, which made its way into the final redaction of the Jewish Bible. Please,
Okay,
you have another question.
Okay, and the third question was at slide 33. You considered two players, this A and B, and two gods and two players, two goods, yes. And if there are three, then the equilibrium story becomes much more complicated, you see. And what do you think about it? So your model, you see, just in this case, when you reduce it to two gods, it is interesting, and but in case we have three of them, the story becomes much more complex. Okay, and just I would like to say thank you. It was very, very interesting.
Okay. Thank you very much. On this, you're totally right. Of course, with many gods and many goods, or many fields, especially many gods, things become more complicated, obviously. I followed an ancient principle for us economists that for most problems, not all problems, but for most problems, a 2 by 2 model is enough because it suggests the basic message that you want to reach. In other words, you could multiply this 2 by 2 thing model for different things, right? So in one case you have I don't know a pair of gods or goddesses both interested in war and marriage. All right. Then you could have another pair of gods or goddesses interested in both, I don't know, the law and commercial transactions with foreign people, and so on and so forth, right? The basic idea that doesn't change. And the advantage here is to make the thing understandable to a wider readership is that with a 2 by 2 model, you can have diagrams with more dimensions. Of course, you can't. You can have a mathematical model. Of course, one could do that. But my impression is that you don't gain much greater insight by doing that. I might be wrong. Huh?
May I comment on this? Because I don't agree with you. Because whether you have 2 players or 3, you have 3 players, you're in a completely different world because you have coalition formation, all of that. And you see in game theory, you know, well, von Neumann Morgenstern is quite well developed for zero-sum games with 2 players, you know. But as soon, you know, there's a 3rd player, then everything explodes actually, you know. So it's but what I want to comment on is actually that very often the players, if there are more than 2, try to reduce the complexity of the multitude of players to two players. That's where we get the pure conflicts then, you know. But originally you might have 3, 4, 5, 6 players, and then the players don't know how to behave, what to do, because you cannot go over Nash equilibrium. So I think it's endogenous that we very often have a 2 by 2 2-player game, you know, and also only 2 strategies very often, because players behave like that.
Manfred, there's a basic misunderstanding here. When I was, it's my fault probably. When I was responding to Fuad about the 2 by 2 model, I was not talking about the game. I was talking about the model of divine preferences and allocation of offerings to the gods, which is not a game. There are no players. It's a different thing. The game is, well, there are 2 games in the book, very, very simple. One is a game between priests, okay? And another is the one that I just mentioned briefly, the game between gods and priests, okay? Of course, when we talk about a game, of course, having 2 players or more players make all the difference of the world. You are quite right, but I'm not doing that. In those games, actually, at least in the one that I briefly illustrated before, the players are 2, gods and priests. I couldn't imagine a 3rd player unless, I don't know, I could think about it, but the conception was exactly 2. But the discussion with Fuad before was not about that, but about the Edgeworth box, which is not a game. There's no conflict. There's nothing like that. It's only an allocation model.
Well, that depends how you define it, but you can write it as a game. And then, of course, you have conflict along the contract curve.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can have bargaining around that. Sure, I thought about that, but that's a further step. It's not a complication. It's a further step. It's not having three players. It's a further step to solve the indeterminacy of the Pareto set.
Yeah, but think about an Edgeworth box, with 3 players, you get in terrible problems.
I'm sure you do, but why doing that? There's no play, there's no game there, and it's something I don't get. I don't get it.
Well, of course, there's never a game there, but you can always write it as a game. I think any situation. I mean,
okay.
Well, actually, you are one of them who does a lot of work, which is in completely different spheres, and you write it in a way, and it needs a little bit of transformation, and then you have standard game theory in there.
But you think there would be something to gain to do that here?
No, I just wanted, so to say, defend the question of Fuad in a way, because it makes a big difference, whether you have 2 players or 3 players. And your reaction was a bit like, doesn't matter so much. Well, it's just because at the moment, I'm very interested. Does somebody know in here Ascayon's 3 electics, or triolectics? Ascayon is a painter, the most famous Danish painter. He does also philosophy, and he worked or proposed something which is called triolectics. And what you see is that you have all kind of chaos there. Well, his example is you have 3 soccer games playing the same time on a field, the field looks like a Y somehow, 3 goals, and then they play. This is his example, his illustration, and it's completely different, from a 2-player game.
Manfred's story, as far as I understood, Mario, the story is the following. You see, we don't have opposite interests in a sense. You see, we rather have some kind of division of the. It's like a linear programming story. You see, like a division of some volume of some good. You see, we can, in a sense, you see, interpret it in that way, you see.
Yeah.
So, but if we come to the idea of opposite interests, then naturally everything becomes enormously complicated. And I don't know, from the point of view of these religions, to which extent they should, it is possible to adjust this pantheon to this very problem, you see. That is the story. Sorry.
Okay, there's Shanti. Please go ahead.
Well, I know very little about gods and have little to do with priests, but I thought that priests define gods. So this distinction between priests and gods in this 2-dimensional.
Sorry, I can't hear you well. Can you speak a bit louder?
Now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Gods are defined by priests, presumably. I can't imagine gods being independent of how they're defined. Now, can you explain to me why, in your 2x2 explanation, the 2 are different, gods and priests? How do you separate them? Because all we know about gods is what the priests tell us.
I'm not sure I understand the question. They are defined. The gods are defined by the literature we have, basically. The mythology, the hymns, the sacred literature. That there's a lot of things, but the definition of their characters is not something I choose. It's something that is and the empirical material on which we work.
Right. So what do the priests do? Presumably in the literature, priests also define gods.
They define the characters of gods. Whether the god is more interested in this or that, or he has the capacity to affect this field or that field, or you know.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Ron, sorry.
Mario, so it's very interesting. It's a lot of fun. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit about monotheism. And so, monotheism displaced the gods in the Roman Empire, and so I think you have a kind of efficiency explanation for that. And what I'm curious about is the dimensions. So, on which monotheism is more or less efficient than polytheism, because I could think you could make arguments both ways, but you seem to have something worked out there, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yep, sure. I was hoping in this question because I had a slide on this. Wait. Right. There is this ubiquitous idea that polytheism has all but disappeared today because it's obviously inferior to monotheism, right? This is a very Christianized account. By the way, I was exposed to that when I first was taught the Greek and Roman classics in high school, which means a long time ago, in which the basic idea was that these people had wonderful philosophy, wonderful art, wonderful poetry, wonderful tragedy, but of course their religion was all bullshit, right? Now, I was always wondering how that could be possible, and now that I'm going back to these things, I think I know a bit better. Anyway, so the point that is made in this book is that the Indo-European polytheism had deep problems that I explained. Those problems, if unaddressed, could bring it down. Okay. Now, the Greek and Roman version of it failed to address those problems and finally collapsed. But the failure to address the problem of multiplication of gods, divine jealousy, the cost of it, etc. The failure to solve that does not explain the rise or the triumph of Christianity. Christianity was an exogenous thing that came from outside and was not a product nor a response to the inefficiency of polytheism. If Christianity had never arose, but just fictionally, right, in a fictional world, Greek and Roman religion might have persisted forever. Although the fact that it was inefficiently organized made the Christian success easier, because the incentive for priests to resist the rise of Christianity was lacking in the first place. On the other hand, where polytheism was reformed, that is in India and Iran, deeply reformed, Christianity and Islam had a much harder time to make their way in, as we know also. Both religions found ways towards monotheism that didn't involve the total rejection of previous religion or the previous polytheistic religion. So in another parallel universe, the Greek and Roman priests might have overcome their political subjection to the state and made up themselves as an interest group. And so they might have reformed their polytheism. So this book is not, in no sense, it is a case for monotheism or a theory of the transition from the one to the other. if anything, what was proved in the book was not the superiority of monotheism over polytheism, but the superiority of one priesthood organization over another. I don't know if this answers your question a bit.
Vikas Kumar wanted
Vikas.
to ask you some questions. Yeah,
Vikas, please. Nice
Good
to have you
evening.
here.
Yeah, good evening. I enjoyed your presentation a lot, and you put together a very parsimonious explanation of a very broad historical phenomenon. I have a few observations though. I'm going to read the book as soon as it comes out, but my curiosity makes me ask a few questions at this stage itself. The first thing that I want to ask Professor Ferrero is that you seem to use the metaphor of market to understand a theological problem. So you sort of and you seem to assume that the transaction between the gods and humans, involves the search good. Now, and you assume that there is a clear separation between producers of your theology and consumers of theology. So I feel that these implicit assumptions might be problematic. I'm not sure how the analysis or the outcomes will change if when I go to a church, I don't simply buy a loaf of bread. I co-produce that bread. I am part of the operations through which the clergy produce faith. So there's no clear distinction between the producers and consumers. Yeah, even if we assume that there's a clear separation between the producers and consumers of faith, we have to additionally also assume, if I'm not wrong in your analysis, that the good being exchanged is a search good. Now, search good is something where just to reiterate the definition, where you know the properties before you purchase that good. Now, in case of faith, we often come to know about them after we purchase them. Right? Now, this means that when I begin to engage with say Hinduism or Christianity or whatever, in the beginning I have no idea at all. I gradually become accustomed to that, or I drift away from that. Now, the fact, in case I'm getting accustomed, so then the production process and functions will have to be very, different from the world where I go to a market and purchase something out there. So this was the first observation. The other point I'd like to make, and this links with the earlier discussion on whether 2 or 3 players make a difference. You have if you just try to think of the Indian example, now there are 2 kinds of collisions possible. One collision is possible among different cults or different priesthoods. So if you think of in India of Shiva, Vishnu, and finally Shakti, the Shakti and Shiva cults are pretty close to each other. In fact, every Shakti temple also has Shiva, every Shiva temple also has Shakti. So you see that between these 3 cults, 2 of them have historically teamed together, and that coalition continues until today. Now, this second kind of coalition is possible among the 3 classes. The production class and the barrier class can come together against the priestly class. So if you think of it, the entire later Vedic Upanishadic revolution was in a way the assertion of the production, the barrier class against the priestly class. So most of the authors of the Upanishads happen to come from not from the priestly class. So So even in this very simple world of three cults and three classes, you have significant coalition formations. Now I do not know at this stage, if we introduce coalitions, if your conclusions are going to be affected. But I'm still trying to just push this forward, that there is a possibility of significant and stable coalitions over time.
Okay, because is that your question now, or
Yeah,
because
Comment is
I'm
that it's an
observation?
observation, and maybe he might want to say something on that.
Yeah.
but
Okay.
because this is very complicated. It would be a good idea if you have any time to spare in the next few days, if you could write me a mail with the points clear. I can. It's probably better than just talking like this. If you have time, I would really appreciate that. But as a first impression on the previous point, on the first point, it is true. It is true, absolutely true, that in my approach, I'm collapsing uh, the ordinary people, the believer, or the supplicant, and the priest into one thing. In other words, the consumer of religion and the producer of religion, in some sense, are put together when it comes to interacting with the gods. Okay, with the offers within the gift exchange. All right, the two things are differentiated when it comes to uh, focusing on the priests themselves, because they are key actors in the whole drama here, right? Okay, so I spend a lot of time on the priests, but it's true that when we interact, when there is the interaction between God and man, man in quotes includes everything, including the priests if they are there, or whoever you may think of. But what's wrong with that? I'm not sure I'm missing something by doing this. By the way, in economics, there is a long tradition, starting at least with Gary Becker, I think, of the what is called the home production, right? Household production, in which you consume and produce something at home with your own work. You produce your consumption by using your work time or your effort or something like that. By the way, this is often used in the economics of religion when it comes to analyzing a sect in which people devote time to worship, and by doing this, they produce the good that they consume. It's not circular or contradictory. It's just a modeling device that simplifies matters. Uh, I have a sort of physiological tendency to make the modeling as simple as possible in every case, because I think that by Occam's razor, if you can get to something with less technical machinery, it's better than with more than that. So I'm willing to turn to more complex modeling if I can see the benefit to be gained from it. I'm not sure where the benefit is here, but I might have missed something in what you said. Huh?
George is waiting. I think George, you wanted to comment, huh? Sorry about that.
George.
I
Sorry.
don't want to comment. I just want to go to the point that Shanti raised, that we know gods from the priests, and I'm challenging that. The ancients didn't know, the primitive man didn't know, especially the Greeks always thought that the gods were there. The ancient Greeks never used the word "I believe in God." It was a matter of existence. They were around, so they did not need to be told by the priests that gods existed.
Or at least it's an old story, right? It's another very biased Christian account of polytheism. We Christians and the Jews and the Muslims, this is based on faith, belief. Those people, they are just trade, with the gods at the temple. Okay, they don't believe in anything. In a sense, this is ridiculous, because if you make a sacrifice to a god and expect a benefit from it, you must at least believe that the god is there and is listening to you, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. So, in that sense, the contrast between faith and transaction is beside the point. I mean, it's wrong, simply. But George is right. I mean, given that the ancient, but I'm sure also the ancient Indians, I'm sure everyone in general believed that there were powers there who would respond to us if asked in the proper way, etc. Right? Having said that, you don't ask yourself, does God exist? This is a modern question. George is right.
Okay, I think it's time actually to conclude, because we are over time actually. And of course, we are here in Munich, and that's where Occam died, I mean, so we should also apply Occam's razor to our performance here. Okay, thank you very much, Mario. It was a very inspiring presentation, and
thank you to you all for listening. It was very good for me.
And then, of course, George introduced wonderfully, so it was a good session, and thank you all for coming.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.